Hi everybody, this is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Tuesday, May the 28th, and welcome to our video commentary. Well, if you're following the news coming out of Cuba, I'm sure you heard that the Cuban government has just made some pretty tough announcements about impending shortages and how things are going to get really bad. There are going to be food shortages, there's going to be long lines, there's obviously some problems with fuel supplies. I mean, basically the country is once again in a state of shock, recovering from its latest case of socialism. Really, that's what this is all about. And of course, what the Cuban government does every time there's a shortage, the Cuban government blames the United States, the so-called embargo. And it is true that under President Trump here recently, the government has re-energized part of the embargo, particularly as it relates to people who are filing lawsuits against the Cuban government for stolen property. That is true. That is something that President Trump has done, but that has nothing to do with the shortages in Cuba today. Even if President Trump had not reactivated that part of the embargo, the country would still be having food shortages and all kinds of problems. The problem is that Cuba has never had an economy that can sustain itself. It has always been a country based on somebody subsidizing or supporting the country. First, the Soviet Union for 30 plus years, and then there came a bunch of loans from Western banks, and then more recently from Venezuela. But the country has never been able to sustain itself since the communists took over in the early 1960s. So the result of this has been these periods of shortages and so on, because it simply cannot sustain itself. It has to depend on somebody in the outside, either subsidizing the country directly or providing the country with subsidized oil, as was the case of Venezuela. And it's no different now. And of course, they're blaming President Trump, they're blaming the embargo, and that's a very popular thing to say, particularly in left-wing circles. But, people who blame the embargo for what's happening in Cuba do not understand the embargo. The embargo only applies to American companies. It doesn't stop a Brazilian company, for example, from selling to Cuba. It doesn't stop a Mexican company from selling to Cuba. It doesn't stop any of the European Union countries from selling to Cuba. Japan, China, all of those countries, South Korea, all of those countries can sell to Cuba without having to worry about the embargo, and yet they don't. And they don't. And one of the reasons they don't is because Cuba is not able to pay back most of these debts or most of these loans for the simple reason that it doesn't have a self-sustaining economy. It's like, giving money to somebody, but he has no ability to pay back. And that's what's happening in Cuba. So there's not going to be any change in Cuba until there is a change in regime, until there's a change in the socialist system that has destroyed Cuba. I think sometimes Cuba is exhibit A for any young American who's trying to figure out what socialism is all about. I know we talk a lot about Venezuela, and they're having their own problems too. But Cuba has been at this a lot longer, and the failure of socialism in Cuba is now going into 5 decades. And it's just exhibit A of why socialism just simply does not work. It simply does not work. Well, thank you for watching. We have all of these on YouTube, on Twitter, and on my blog. And if today's your birthday, happy birthday. Bye-bye, everybody.